Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. The book by Peter Schmitz is now available. Order it at your local bookstore or through Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. Hello and welcome to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories about the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, and our original theme music, which you just heard, is by Christopher Mark Colucci. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound. Join us as we continue our Season 4, The Rise of Modern Philadelphia Theater. Today, we will begin the story of one of the biggest professional nonprofit theaters in the Philly area throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the Philadelphia Drama Guild. Ever since the beginning of the Little Theater movement in the early 20th century, Philadelphia and its environs, like most American urban areas, was full of amateur theater groups and community drama organizations. Many of these groups were run and stocked by people who had studied theater in local colleges and universities, but now they were doing something else, professionally speaking, but they just couldn't leave behind the joy, satisfaction, and sense of community that doing theater brought them. In the 1930s, many of them continued to study acting with Jasper Dieter in classes that he offered at the Hedgerow Theater. Others would join the classes offered by Mae Desmond in West Philadelphia, or at Miss Shallett's School of Expression and Dramatic Art at the former Musical Arts Club on Randstead Street in Center City, or at the Theater League on Chancellor Street to the west of Rittenhouse Square, or with the Germantown Theater Club in Northwest Philadelphia, or the Community Players who had a home in South Philadelphia. And there were literally dozens of others. Many of these community theater groups created their own performance spaces in church basements, social club halls, hotel ballrooms, converted movie theaters, even old barns and stables. But the real gem for little theater groups in Philly remained the Plays and Players Theater, which we've talked about many times, built in 1913 at 1714 Delancey Street, which throughout the 20th century remained a consistent rental venue for all these community theater groups. And often, Plays and Players had a resident community company of its own. Also actively utilized by community theaters was the large ballroom theater space at Philadelphia's YMHA, YWHA on South Broad and Pine, which naturally was frequented by Jewish-oriented community theater groups, as the double acronym stood for Young Men's Hebrew Association or Young Women's Hebrew Association, the Jewish community's counterpoint to all the ubiquitous YMCAs throughout the area. In the post-war years of the 40s and 50s, some of these amateur theater groups and theater schools had folded, true. Others hung on, and still others were being newly formed. We've mentioned in previous episodes, for example, and someday soon, we promise we will come back to it, the Society Hill Playhouse, run by Jay and Dean Cogan, for example. But in the summer of 1956, a community theater group called the Shakespeare Classic Theater began doing shows outdoors in the Germantown neighborhood, before later finding a winter home indoors at the YMHA, YWHA on Broad Street. Changing its name at that point to the Drama Guild, it moved to the Plays and Players, and over the years, it continued to do productions, mostly classic plays, Brecht, Shaw, Shakespeare, O'Casey, as well as modern plays like those of Jules Feiffer. The Drama Guild had built up a loyal legion of subscribers and supporters along the way, and it was especially known for its educational mission and performances that it did for local school groups. Now, the driving force behind the growth and success of the Philadelphia Drama Guild was a dentist, one Sidney Bloom, DDS to be precise. Originally, Dr. Bloom had caught the acting bug himself and had appeared in shows with the Guild, but after a while he realized, as he said, there were 1,000 actors better than me. he became the producer of the organization instead, keeping it alive through all the inevitable vicissitudes that it sunk many of those other similar groups, mostly by maintaining a very tight hand on the group's finances. But Dr. Bloom also kept up his successful dentistry practice. In fact, he had a very nice list of well-connected patients, it turned out. Among them was not only the current governor of Pennsylvania, Milton Shapp, but also Richard Bennett, who was executive director of the very wealthy Haas Community Foundation, which had recently underwritten the restoration of the Walnut Street Theater. There had always been some talk that the Theater of the Living Arts might take over the Walnut Street space, as we mentioned over previous episodes, but as we've related, the TLA's edgy artistic reputation and its chronic financial instability doomed that prospect in the end. And in the year 1970, just as the Walnut Project neared completion, the TLA was defunct. So, what to do, thought the Haas Foundation. Now, Philadelphia, unlike every other major metropolitan area in the country, had no major nonprofit repertory theater company. And the Haas Foundation desperately wanted some resident professional company for their new Walnut Theater space. Sidney Bloom raised his hand, and his patient, Richard Bennett, gave him $63,000 in seed money to turn the Drama Guild into a professional theater company that would engage Actors' Equity union actors. But how could a local dentist succeed when the equally well-connected Andre Gregory, say, had failed? The answer was star power. It turned out that Sidney Bloom's neighbor at his vacation home over on the Jersey Shore was the veteran New York actor John Randolph. Now, in a period when Broadway was in a bit of a decline, John Randolph knew that there were loads of Broadway quality actors who would love to do classic parts in a great play in a nearby city, as long as it was understood that they still had plenty of flexibility to drop out or reschedule if they suddenly got a big TV gig or a big movie part at the last minute. The very popular John Randolph passed the word around to his wide New York circle of friends, and soon there were a lot of big-name actors who were willing to come to Philly, and there were a lot of eager Philadelphians who wanted to come and see shows at the Walnut, and this was the big draw, where they knew they would like the shows beforehand. So, Sidney Bloom was soon able to announce to his delighted subscribers that in the Guild's first fully professional season, he was going to bring them such big names as Hume Cronyn and Jessica Tandy in Sheridan's play, The Rivals, the actress Diana Sands, and John Randolph in the Garson Kanin play Born Yesterday, and Julie Harris in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. Soon phones at the Drama Guild's offices were ringing off the hook, and it had 16,000 subscribers within a few weeks of announcing their season. Each play was given a budget of about $80,000, and ticket prices were set at a very reasonable rate of about $4 to $8. Now, in fact, as we shall see, even though most of those shows would end up not actually being produced as planned, nobody seemed upset, because there were still other stars and other reliable, delightful classic plays being produced in their place. December 1st, 1971. The Philadelphia Drama Guild opened Moliere's The Imaginary Invalid, its very first professional production. The Walnut Street Theater, newly rebuilt and remodeled, was the venue. In the cast were E.G. Marshall as the hypochondriac title character, Argon. Ruby Dee played his wife, Belline, and Tammy Grimes was the maid, Toinette. There were also Philadelphia actors in the company, including Doug Wing and Patrick Cronin. The set was designed by the Philadelphian Clark Dunham, but the direction was by Broadway regular Stephen Porter. And in the midst of it all, as preparations came for the opening night, was Dr. Bloom, who amazingly was also keeping up with his dentistry practice at the same time. And he was keeping costs low by drawing no salary himself as the producer. William Ross had the title of artistic director, but it was clear who was calling the shots. Enthusiasm for the new professional drama guild amongst local audiences, as we said, was overwhelming. And here's an interesting twist, and now you'll see why in our last episode I had to talk so much about new theater construction throughout the city. The Drama Guild was not only going to perform in one place, not just at the Walnut Street Theater, which had also been created to host films and concert and dance performances after all. So a theater group could rent the Walnut only for certain blocks of time, and it couldn't be there every week throughout the season as a resident company with an unbroken schedule of plays. And the same went for the brand new Annenberg Center over in West Philadelphia. So the Drama Guild arranged with both venues to do parts of each production in their season in both theaters, 2 weeks at the Walnut and then one at the Zellerbach. It was a little confusing, and it required a lot of logistics, moving the sets about and everything, but everyone went with it. And right away, Dr. Bloom had to invoke the flexibility clause in their artistic and business model because for the week's extension run of Imaginary Invalid at the Zellerbach, suddenly neither Marshall nor John Randolph was available to take over the role, so the actor Leonard Fry, who had been seen as Mottle the Tailor in the recently released film Fiddler on the Roof, took over the title role. And to tell you the truth, Philadelphia audiences kind of liked all this excitement. Well-known actors coming and going, lots of stories in the newspapers, lots of great shows, if not deeply rehearsed shows, and great productions were going up. People were meeting all their friends at the theater again. Big politicians like Governor Shapp were coming to opening nights. It was fun. And local critics praised Stephen Porter's directions of the Molière play. Indeed, in a weird kind of synergy, the touring production of another Molière play that Porter had just directed, School for Wives, starring Brian Bedford, was coming to town that same week at the Forest Theater, just a few blocks up Walnut Street. In January of 1972, the Drama Guild brought in its next show, with now John Randolph, starring, as agreed, as the big corrupt politician Harry Brooke in Garson Kanan's 1946 political comedy Born Yesterday. Diana Sands, who had been announced for the show, had needed to drop out, but they got Cheetah Rivera to come in and take her part. Earl Hyman was also in the cast, and you'll notice that right from the start, the Drama Guild was establishing a policy of casting talented actors in classic roles regardless of their race, which had in fact been their policy almost from the very founding. So that was very admirable. Their next show, opening March 1st, was yet another classic comedy. Clearly, the Drama Guild was going to keep a good thing going while it had it, but with some changes on the fly. Sheridan's School for Scandal replacing his play The Rivals on the bill, and since apparently Hume Cronin and Jessica Tandy had had to drop out, they got the TV stars Imogen Coca as Mrs. Malaprop, while her husband, King Donovan, did Bob Acres. Again, there were some professional Philadelphia actors like Doug Wing and Jim Lambert in smaller roles, and again, local audiences and critics were giddy in praise of the eventual result. Although some of the critics did point out that the show was somewhat under-rehearsed, to their eyes. For its final production of the season, in April 1971, they brought Ben Jonson's Commedia dell'arte-style farce Volpone, about a Venetian miser who tricks his enemies into thinking that he's dying and is going to leave one of them his fortune and his will. So everyone showers him with presents and favors, hoping to become his only heir, only to learn that he's not actually dying at all. But by the end, the trickster is himself deceived. Now, Volpone was a very popular play in the 1970s, and it was being presented in many leading theater troupes around the world, even though it was sometimes difficult for modern audiences to make out all of Jonson's Elizabethan-era wordplay. The Guild, to overcome this difficulty, was using a modern adaptation of the text, which tidied things up a bit. Anyway, it had also managed to snag the actors Howard Da Silva to play Volpone and Ken Howard as his chief nemesis, Mosca. The opening night of Volpone went like gangbusters, and the cast showered the audience with gold and silver coins during the curtain call. Now, the coins were fake, of course, but they served to hype up the excitement even more. The critic William Collins reported in the Sunday Inquirer that even after the house lights came up, the moment when traditionally Philly audiences would all grab their coats and race for the parking lot, instead, they stayed in their seats. They kept facing the stage. They kept applauding. Finally, Da Silva and Howard were summoned out from their dressing rooms. now half out of their costumes, and together with the rest of the company, they came out to bow some more. Nothing like that had happened in the course of the Philadelphia Drama Guild's first professional seasons, Collins wrote. In fact, he couldn't recall such a thing happening in Philadelphia ever, except maybe when Pearl Bailey had come to town in Hello, Dolly. This was such heady enthusiasm for a non-profit regional company. The first season of the Drama Guild had been a roaring success. The only question was, would those now 18,000 subscribers return for the next season of the Drama Guild? Had Philadelphia found its own indisputable #1 namesake nonprofit resident theater company at last? The big problem was, of course, that the instability in the artistic model of the company would result in instability in its finances. How long could the Theater Guild keep promising their subscribers certain big-name actors and certain interesting shows only to cancel them at the last minute and then bring somebody else in and some different script in instead? At first, their plan was to market the next season as coming from a pool of possible big names, everyone from Zero Mostel to Moses Gunn to E.G. Marshall, but eventually they settled on a season that they could actually deliver. And I gotta say, it was a doozy. First, they presented to subscribers a production of Moliere's Tartuffe, starring Richard Kiley, best known for Man of La Mancha, of course, who played the dastardly hypocrite, and a young actress named Bernadette Peters in the soubrette role of Doreen. And the whole company was led by the up-and-coming young director, Michael Kahn. Following that was the real-life husband and wife couple Ann Jackson and Eli Wallach in Jean Anouilh's Waltz of the Toreadors, and then there was Tom Ewell in O'Casey's Juno and the Paycock, and finally Douglas Turner Ward in the Negro Ensemble Company's production of Lonnie Elder's Ceremonies and Dark Old Men. So, finally, a little less comedy, but the Drama Guild was keeping its reputation amongst the New York acting community because big names kept coming to Philly in the third Drama Guild season of 1973-74, which opened with Maureen Stapleton and Jerry Orbach in Tennessee Williams' The Rose Tattoo, and then Tammy Grimes again played Kate in Taming of the Shrew, opposite Ron O'Neal as Petruchio. Ron O'Neal was best known then for being a very different kind of badass in the hit film Superfly. We should note, perhaps, that the production was directed by the Canadian director Malcolm Black, who was going to regularly keep on directing shows at the Walnut Street Theater over the next 40 years. Sidney Bloom, DDS, was still keeping a firm hand on the programming and the finances of the Drama Guild, but the company was no longer doing those additional runs over in West Philadelphia at the Zellerbach, which began looking itself for more adventurous programming than the Drama Guild was ready to provide. In fact, Philadelphia audiences and critics alike that third season were starting to notice a certain, well, let's call it a thrown-together quality to the Drama Guild's productions, with actors all bringing their own idiosyncratic interpretations of their roles. Now, this would have been normal for star appearances at the Walnut or the Chestnut Street Theater in the 19th century, say back in the 1830s. But by the late 20th century, most people had come to expect a unified production. And by February of 1974, that tendency to disunity became all too real when the company of Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman arrived in town. Now, this production of Arthur Miller's iconic play was a real coup for the Drama Guild. It was the 25th anniversary of the first production of Death of a Salesman, which, as you know, if you've read that chapter in my book, had its world premiere at the Locust Street Theater en route to Broadway in January of 1949. But Arthur Miller had subsequently been reluctant to see the play restaged on Broadway since that amazing original production. Indeed, Death of a Salesman had not been mounted within a 100-mile radius of New York City since 1949. And in his standard contract for the play, Arthur Miller always insisted on being able to personally visit and supervise the final week of rehearsals of any production anywhere at all. Now, for this show in Philadelphia, The actors Martin Balsam and Teresa Wright had been cast as Willie and Linda Lohman, and Balsam had personally asked his friend, the movie actor George C. Scott, to be the show's director, based on Scott's recent success with a New York production of the Andersonville trial. In fact, Scott, who, if you remember the early 1970s, had recently refused to accept his Oscar for his work on the film Patton, had declared that he didn't want to act anymore. He mostly wanted to direct from now on. As was now usual for a Drama Guild production that used major New York talent, the first 3 weeks of rehearsals were in New York. And then the company came down to Philadelphia for one final week of rehearsal, and they were staying and rehearsing at the Adelphia Hotel at 13th and Chestnut Streets. But by now, apparently, there were some tensions within the cast. Both Balsam and Wright were reportedly frustrated that George C. Scott mostly did complete run-throughs rather than ever breaking down the show and working in individual scenes. He would then give afterwards extensive notes with long sessions, giving the actors, especially Balsam, impassioned lined readings. It seemed evident to many in the cast that George C. Scott would very much like to play the role of Willie Lohman himself. Now, reportedly, Scott had not been aware, when he agreed to direct the show, that Arthur Miller would come down to observe and oversee the production in this last week. After Miller had come and watched a rehearsal on Thursday the 23rd, Scott went off for a 1.5-hour-long interview at the Adelphia's restaurant with Enquirer reporter Howard Coffin. The actor, according to the reporter, spoke at length about himself, and he seemed in a very good mood. But Coffin would remember that Scott had downed at least 5 vodkas and 2 beer chasers during their talk. And when the interview was up, Scott left saying he had to meet Arthur Miller for dinner and discuss the show. Well, whatever happened at that dinner between Arthur Miller and George C. Scott, it didn't go too well. The next day, Philly newspapers announced that Arthur Miller was taking over the direction of Death of a Salesman. The excuse was that Scott had a, quote, bad cold. But that flimsy story was very soon revealed as being a polite fiction. Actually, he'd gone to Mexico, where his wife, Trish Vanderveer, was scouting locations for their next movie. So, Arthur Miller himself guided the Drama Guild's production of Death of a Salesman through its final week of rehearsal, and the show opened on February 28th to mostly positive reviews. But here's the thing I still haven't totally confirmed yet. That same week, Zubin Mehta was leading the Philadelphia Orchestra in a concert of Beethoven's 7th Symphony at the Academy of Music. Did Miller take Martin Balsam to go and hear it? To inspire him in the part of Willie with Beethoven's magnificent music? And then later, when he was writing his memoirs, Time Bends, mixed that concert up with his first performance of Salesman back in 1949. I'm still waiting for someone who's read that chapter in my book to either confirm or deny it. I thought that would be the thing everyone would write about, but so far I heard nothing. I still think I'm right. A lot changed over the next few years at the Walnut Street Theater, where Richard Dupree was now heading the nonprofit Arts Center, spearheading the drive to turn the upper floors of the adjoining building into more rehearsal rooms, studios, and offices and performance spaces. Dupree was also determined to do more programming that explicitly invited the city's African-American population into the space, and was casting a rather grim eye over at the Drama Guild, his main tenant, which wasn't always great about paying his rent on time for the many weeks that it took over the Walnut stage. Things were also changing at the Drama Guild itself. In the summer of 1974, the Drama Guild's board, dissatisfied with the uneven quality of its productions, hired the 62-year-old British director Douglas Seal to be its new artistic director. Douglas Seal had been steadily working in both London and Canada for years now, and he was able to bring along with him a core company of reliable repertory actors to Philadelphia, as well as being able to recruit from the growing number of excellent classically trained actors coming out of Canada and England in those days, such as the marvelous Paxton Whitehead, who himself directed the season's opening show, Bernard Shaw's Misalliance. All that season Local theater critics purred over the results of Douglas Seal's leadership, but the original founder of the company, Sidney Bloom, DDS, was increasingly frustrated, repeatedly butting heads with both Seal and the company's new business manager, James D. Friedberg. Sidney Bloom felt that he should still have final say over all business and programming decisions, as he had done for the past 20 years. In the spring of 1976, it all came out into the open when Sidney Bloom fired Friedberg as business manager, but then did not reckon with the board, where Friedberg still had a vote. In fact, it turned out that a majority of the board of directors were totally on Friedberg and Seal's side, and a month later, another vote was taken, and suddenly Friedberg was rehired, and the company cut all ties with its founder. It was hard to comprehend for many of his loyal fans, but Sid Bloom, and his conservative and traditional approach to theater, as many accused, was out of the Drama Guild permanently. I can't possibly follow every twist and turn of board politics, nor can I talk about every play the Drama Guild produced during the 1970s. There were a lot, but let's at least take a look at a couple. March 11th, 1977. John Glover was now Philadelphia's favorite Hamlet. Theatergoers were mobbing the box office. The production at the Philadelphia Drama Guild had just opened the night before, and it was already a hit. The run had been extended to March 31st, which was as far as the company could manage to hold its rental on the Walnut Street Theater stage. Now, this was all a mystery to many of the local critics, many of whom had mixed opinions about director Douglas Seal's staging of Hamlet, but Philadelphia audience's verdict was in, and in only a scattering of seats remained for the entire run, as well as the 4 extra performances the Drama Guild had managed to tack on. Seal had cut Shakespeare's text drastically and had moved the time frame so that the actors were costumed in Edwardian-era clothes rather than Elizabethan. The emphasis was on the physical action, with a thrilling duel between Hamlet and Laertes in the final scene. And it must have also been the appeal of John Glover. The actor was then 33 years old, already popular in Philadelphia due to his previous appearances with the Drama Guild. Glover had been ostentatiously walking the streets of the city, dressed entirely in black, just like the melancholy Dane. He would even rehearse his lines with the waitstaff at Cobblestone's restaurant in Society Hill, or at Judy's bar on 3rd and Bainbridge. And as he cradled a bottle of beer at Judy's one evening after a show, wearing a black peasant's blouse, black pants, and black boots, John Glover told a local journalist that he believed that only by living life as fully as possible could he develop the inventory of experiences and insights an actor must have to be effective. If I don't have a life, I can't be an actor. November 30th, 1977. Tom Stoppard's play, Travesties, began a 3-week run at the Walnut as part of the Philadelphia Drama Guild's season. Artistic director Douglas Seal was the director of the show, whose cast included Paxton Whitehead as the British diplomat Henry Carr, who, in a remarkable entrance, emerged from under the stage, playing upon an organ. The dazzling theatrical spectacle of the show only got better from then on, as Stoppard's mash-up of an amateur production of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest in Zurich during the First World War coincided with the presence in the city of the novelist James Joyce, the artist Tristan Tzara, and the revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. It was quite an ambitious season overall for the Drama Guild, which had begun in the fall with George Kelly's comedy, The Show-Off, and in early 1978 they were to produce both George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan and Chekhov's Uncle Vanya. And although the original plan was for the Drama Guild to produce a 6-play season, the Drama Guild was performing to audiences that were 90% full in the 1,100-seat Walnut Street house. Still, the accumulated debt of over $100,000 was worrying the company's board. So, over Seal's objections, only 4 plays were offered. And again, though Philadelphia theater critics, as I can see, were delighted with the production of Travesties and dazzled by Stoppard's comic wordplay and historical insight, there had been increasing dissent among longtime Drama Guild board members and theatergoers at the play's relentless intellectualism. Critic William Collins noted that many of the audience left after the first act, baffled or angry, or both. September 24th, 1979. The Drama Guild, still the only local producing organization in the city who regularly offered contracts to Actors Equity members, held the first ever citywide auditions for professional actors who actually lived in the Philadelphia area. It was an important moment for the Philadelphia theater community, whose small but growing number of professional performers were finally getting a little respect, more than they'd ever gotten during the city's long-held status as a tryout town, certainly. Now, previously, all auditions for paying gigs at the Drama Guild took place only in New York. But now, they would do them in Philly. Wrote the journalist Edgar Weidman in The Inquirer, but the times, they are a-changin', and one of the first moves by Gregory Poggi, who became managing director of the company only 2 months ago, was to hold auditions here for actors residing in the area. Nearly 100 equity actors showed up yesterday. So, what had changed at the Drama Guild? And who was this Gregory Poggi? Well, ladies and gentlemen, tune in next time to find out, because we are finally going to begin the much-promised series of shows where I will bring you interviews with actual participants in the events of Philadelphia theater history. Gregory Poggi, whom I spoke with via telephone back in November of last year, will be our first of these subjects, and he has a lot of fascinating information and insights for us as he helps to tell the story about what happened to the Drama Guild during his tenure at the organization, which spanned the entire decade of the 1980s. Meanwhile, if you haven't gotten a copy already, look for Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia, the book. Go ask for it now at your local independent bookstore or order it online, wherever fine books are sold. If you enjoy it, remember to leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads so that other good folks can learn about it too. And you'd really be giving me a hand. I would appreciate it. Support us on Patreon if you want. The links are in the show notes. And here I give my thanks to Richard, who just signed up last month as a Patreon sustaining member. Or just leave a review about the show on Apple Podcasts. And I should add, you can of course follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can write to us. Our email is aithpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you think about the show. Now, there's no extensive blog post for this episode, I'm afraid. The upcoming semester of teaching approaches next week, and I have to get ready for that. I'll try to throw a few pictures and images of some of the stories we mentioned today at least. Thank you for listening to us and for joining us on yet another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.